Welcome back, everybody. So today we have a brief video talking about how to develop a poster to give at a conference. Now, let's just first start off with the software to actually make a poster. This is a poster that was actually the first poster that I gave, several years ago. And I'm going to use this as an example because some of my newer ones, which I think are actually much better posters, have, sensitive data on it that I don't want to share in a video, but also because I could use this as an opportunity to point out areas that I could have done better, which is actually quite a bit, as you could imagine. So with that, sit back, relax, enjoy. Let's get into this and talk about designing a poster. Now, the software that I use for this poster is PowerPoint. And to do that, you just make a slide that's the same dimensions as what you want your poster to be. I think this is a really good way to start, and a lot of people use PowerPoint to design their posters. However, I do encourage people as they become a little bit more advanced to try to become more familiar with Adobe Illustrator. That's what I use to make posters later down the road. And I think that it's a lot easier once you kind of get the hang of it, and you can manipulate it a lot more and make your poster just look a lot more beautiful, if you will. So do check out both ways. And obviously you're going to want to color it depending on, how you want. So for this one, I made it green just because at the time, the university I was at, their colors were green. But you could go ahead and make them, whatever color your university is, and put the logos up and use different colored text. There's a lot of different guides that you could really follow in terms of what makes for a good poster. That's for a different video. We're not going to quite go into that today. Today, we're going to talk more about content. So the first thing in your poster is obviously going to be the title. And this title is not very good. It's characterizing effects of blank, 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 blank. The reason it's not good is that you want your title to be a declarative statement of what it was that you found. And anytime you're using the word characterizing, that is not declarative. That's basically saying that, well, we found a phenotype and we're just reporting what the phenotype is. That's not very exciting science. So try to stay away from those words. This was a mistake that I made. I should have been more declarative in what I found. Now underneath you have, the people that participated in the study and where they were. Actually, originally this wasn't even underlined. Now I underlined it when I was kind of setting this up just to show you, but it should be underlined, bolded somewhere to call out who you are. Typically you're going to be the first author if you're the one presenting it, but you kind of want to show where you are, let everybody know. Now the way that posters are going to read is going to be from the left down, the center down, and the right side down. That's the way it's going to read logically. So that's the way that you need to set up your poster. And the way your poster is going to be set up is going to be very similar to a paper with a few differences. Now, the first thing you're going to have is your abstract. And right away, this is not good. Your abstract should not take up this whole third of the poster. This is way, way, way too big. The font should be much smaller, and the abstract should go maybe down to about here. And that should be about it. This takes up way too much room, and it just really isn't necessary. It's just a summary of your whole study. You have the whole poster to explain your study. You don't need your abstract to take up a third of it. Instead, what I usually do or what I have done, since making this poster is I have a smaller abstract, and then underneath I put an introduction. And again, your introduction cannot be nearly as long as what you would put in a paper. But what you got to remember is that your poster is going to be hanging up for, days or a week. Depending on how big the conference is. There's very little time that you're actually going to be right next to your poster while it's going on. So keep that in mind, that an introduction will go a long way to letting the reader of your poster know what's happening without you physically needing to be there to explain it to them. So abstract and then introduction, and then you'll go into results. Now, what I would recommend doing rather than just going into results, especially for a study like this, which was just kind of one big study that was put into it. It wasn't like multiple parts to a study. This was more just like one animal study. You should definitely have some sort of an experimental design overview part, maybe like right here. And then, your figure 1 would be over here, something like this, or even have your experimental design take up, a good chunk of this and then go into your results. If you have a very complex study you're talking about, maybe you have one thing that's really critical to the beginning part of your study, like maybe an RNA-seq experiment, which kind of, you used and you identified a hit, and the rest of your study is talking about your hit. Maybe you want to have an experimental design overview to what that RNA-seq experiment was like. I think that's an important thing for a poster. And then you go into the poster. Now, I'll point out that this first part of the figure isn't labeled very well. It's referenced down here, but these are actually data points from a previous study. And that's okay. It's okay to use some data from a previous study. You don't want to go overboard because most of your posters should be new data, but it is okay to include data from an old study. And what I actually did in these, there's a lot in these results sections that could be better. So the titles and the figures are okay, but I think that each one of these titles takes up a ton of space. Really what it should be is these figures should be bigger with a smaller title, and there needs to be legends, just like you would have for figures within a paper. There should be a legend explaining the N, the time point. I have a method section over here on the side, but really this kind of data should be in a legend. So there's a lot that could be improved with this. I think changing the size of the titles, I think that it could be better off with a legend. It could be better off explaining the time points, maybe even a sentence explaining, what the result shows. I think that you could do a lot more with that. When I first made this, I wanted it to be mostly graphical and not so much wordy, but I think that sometimes some words could help, especially knowing that you're not going to be there for the whole time that the poster's up. After you get through your results, you shouldn't have a method section. This shouldn't be there. That's not good. What you should have is a conclusions, as well as a graphical abstract to say, a graphical figure showing what your proposed mechanism is. And the proposed mechanism of your study is much more, whether it's a poster or an oral presentation, this is what separates the very junior researchers from the more senior researchers. Is junior researchers do exactly what I did here. They say, this is my data and these are my conclusions, and that's it. Maybe they'll put in a future direction or two. What a more senior researcher realizes is that the data that you've generated are just part of the scientific method, and that the scientific method is not linear, it is circular. You have a hypothesis, you design a study to test said hypothesis, you generate data that either accepts or rejects the hypothesis, and really it's the null hypothesis, right? Not the hypothesis, null hypothesis. And from there, you generate a new hypothesis, and then you generate a new study to understand that. And the way that you really need to synthesize this down into one thing is the so-called proposed mechanism, which basically shows here is the cell or the animal or whatever it is that you're working on. And this is what I think my data means. If I put it all together within the cell, that this is interacting with that, and this is how they're doing it. And now this is the point in that study that I've identified. And because of this, here's the next point that I'm going to be studying. And being able to synthesize that down into a proposed mechanism really is what's going to separate the junior from the senior researchers. And it's going to make you really, really, really stand out if you could do that. Okay. And the last thing is the references. Again, this could maybe be even smaller, but it's fine. And so that's kind of the overview of the posters. Now, when you give a poster talk, there's two different ways. One of them is when you're just standing there, during the open section and people come up. And that's a lot easier. They'll come up and they'll say, tell me about your poster, or this looks interesting. Can you tell me about it? And this is where you go ahead and you kind of give them a brief introduction. You could go step by step in the figures and they'll ask questions as you go. And then you kind of walk through your graphical, what it was, my proposed mechanism. That's easy. The hard part is when you have to give an actual poster presentation where you have judges that will come and they'll give you 5 minutes to talk. This is much harder. It is completely a myth that it is harder to give long presentations. When you're brand new and you don't have any data, yes, it's hard to talk for an hour. But once you get going, it's easy to put together a 1-hour presentation. it is very hard to synthesize everything that you want in a very, concise manner that's only a few minutes long. Really, that leaves you about a minute for introduction, a minute for conclusions, and about 3 minutes for data. Very fast. That's kind of the order that I would break it up. Is I would give 1 minute introduction, then about 2.5 to 3 minutes for results, and about 1 to 1.5 minutes for your conclusions / proposed mechanism. Now, the last thing that I'm going to say is that you need to have some kind of a notebook by you, because people are going to ask questions. And a lot of the questions and feedback that you get during poster presentations are really valuable. I can't even begin to explain the amount of times that I got some really, really good suggestions on where to take studies that I never even thought of during poster presentations. So always make sure that you have, some pen, paper with you, or phone that you could jot some notes down after talking to somebody. The other thing that you're going to want is to make sure you have a copy of your CV or business card, just because you never know who you're going to meet and network with and who you might want to connect with in the future. So make sure you have that as well. And you could also take some of your business cards and just pin them up as well on the cork board. That way, if you're not there and someone walks by and they really like it, they could take one of your business cards. So yeah, I think that this video is long enough. I think this is a good overview and kind of some of the do's and don'ts of generating a poster. And if anyone, of course, has any more questions about this, leave them in the comments below. I'm happy to answer. Or if there's something specific about like designing it, maybe we can make another video on it. And with that, I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye.